I'm Morgan Motzinger, and I'm highly allergic to surface conversations. So let's dig deep. Together, we'll explore creating meaningful habits, deepening our relationships, and cultivating more hope for a better inner and outer life. This is the PS We Expire podcast. I'm so glad you're here. So we both have dead kids.
Have dead kids. Are we kicking off? What a way to start. Okay, we are diving in. All right, people, buckle up because I can tell this is going to be quite the conversation. First of all, I mean, I have to tell you, so we, obviously were together in recently on the TEDx stage, speaking in Concord, Mass. And when I got the list of who else was going to be giving TED Talks that evening, and I read about everybody's topics, and I saw you, and I was there really speaking about grief literacy specifically. So it kind of encompasses all my grief, of which there is no shortage. But when I saw you there and read about you and that you too have a daughter who had died, mine at 17, yours was
She was 14.
14. I thought, oh God, this audience is in for something tonight, and I knew they'd either put us back to back or spread us out as far as possible.
That's so funny. I like the phrase, I can't remember who, it was like a woman who speaks a lot about grief, but the phrase that she coined and uses quite a lot is like, it's not the bummer Olympics. But you definitely, like, if it was, you would definitely be taking home the gold on like the hard things. Do you want to share like your first kind of experience with grief? And I'd be curious to talk about like how grief has like changes and is different from relationship to relationship and how it's evolved over the years as you've just had like, has it's piled on.
Yeah, definitely. And it is so interesting because we always say, right? I like that it's not the Grief Olympics and, it's not a contest and all of that kind of stuff. And yet, if it were, I know, like the thing nobody wants to be taking home the gold for, that is for sure. So, yeah, I mean, I had a few deaths in my teens that are very, for lack of a better term, conventional. My grandparents died. And then I had a couple of real doozies. My first cousin died and she was in her 30s, followed by my stepfather, who was in his 60s and was sick and was really like a father to me. I was very fortunate. I grew up with essentially three parents, my mother, my father, and my stepfather. So I had just been kind of in the throes of losing my first cousin, losing my stepfather, kind of going through it all with the people closest to me, most notably my sister. And 3 months after my stepfather died, see, this is even more than I mentioned in the TED Talk. 3 months after my stepfather died, just a couple of hours after my sister and I were chit-chatting about absolutely nothing on the phone, she died. Age 30, I was 27, and she died suddenly. She was out with her 1-year-old daughter at an indoor playground, and she went into cardiac arrest and died. And that was the tear me to the ground, tear me open first kind of loss. B, knock me off my feet in terms of not expecting it. And C, okay, I get it now. Anything can happen at any time. So, it was just, we had really been like hand in hand through the losses that directly preceded it. And this was just unfathomable. So that was the one that, as I write about in my book, punctured the bubble I had been living in. And then I started to see things through the clarity of the puncture, because my whole worldview changed. Before I was in this beautiful hazy bubble, and believe me, if I could have lived my whole life in a hazy bubble, I would have. So that was number one. And then it's been a series, some expected, some not, some after short illnesses, and some, most notably my daughters, after a very, very lengthy, insidious, horrific illness. And so now I have lost my three parents, both of my sisters, and then most recently, my 17-year-old daughter.
Hmm. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a lot. And I feel like sometimes, well, there are other people who have lost their whole family, but I feel like when that happens, one of two things is true. Either their whole family was together and there was some kind of horrific accident or something. This was like one by one by one by one. Or and I know families where there's some kind of genetic
Hmm.
condition, some kind of diagnosis that strikes multiple members of a family. But this was not that. These are different reasons. And my daughter Dahlia was adopted. We weren't even genetically related. So, yeah, so that's my kind of broad brushstroke overview of grief. Tell me yours. I told you mine. I
Oh.
showed you mine. Show me yours.
Well, let's see. Um, Similarly, grandparents when I was a kid, but not close to any of them, really close enough to be there in the experience. My dad had prostate cancer for several years, and my parents live on our property, and so particularly the last 6 months of his life when things were really tanking, I was there for that and was there the day that he died. And that, yeah, it feels like it's, I suspect anyway, a different flavor of grief when you're anticipating it and you know that it's coming, when it's like this looming promise that they're going to pass versus a sudden unexpected grief. So my dad died in October of 2021, and then my daughter Annie died in December of 2022.
Mm.
So in a lot of ways, I think the going through what I did with my dad was good preparation for myself and also for my husband and my two other children, where it was like, okay, this is an opportunity for us to talk about what this experience is like. To, it was like we could probably be really direct in the way that we're talking about death in this conversation, but like being in the living room with my dad's body for hours and hours after he died was a really important experience, so that when Annie died at home, I wasn't panicking about like, what am I supposed to do next? Or like,
Mm.
okay, now we have to hurry and call the mortuary to come and pick up her body and stuff. It was much more, I wouldn't say chill, but like much more relaxed and present and peaceful, because I knew ish what to expect with her.
That is so interesting because I have not really thought about it in those terms before, but I can relate to it because I was with my mother in her living
Mm.
room, same as you describe, for quite a while, as she died and after she died. And Dahlia did die at home as well. Yeah. Whereas the others were in the chaos of the hospital, or
Mm.
just not even that, with my father and my one sister, where they were in public places, when it happened. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how there are the flavors and the nuances. And I don't believe there's a better and a worse, so to speak,
Mm.
but there are conditions that are more that tear us apart in a different way, especially I think when you're kind of just doing your thing and the phone rings and it's like,
Yeah.
wait, what?
Yeah. Can you talk more about that, like the puncture hole in your
Yes.
safety bubble? That's such a great
Yeah.
metaphor.
I feel this so strongly because I do think that my first sister, Nomi, that her death changed me more than any of the other deaths. And it's interesting, since since we have just jumped in, but we've already decided we're just saying what we're saying. I'll go there, which is, you know, anybody you ask, it's just kind of common accepted truth that the worst thing that can happen to somebody is that their child dies. And I mean, the people will say that all the time. Single worst thing that can happen is to watch your child die. It's out of order. It's this, it's that, it's the other. Now, I don't like to get into grief hierarchy because I do think circumstances play such an important role, and because loss is loss, and somebody can lose their 98-year-old grandmother and that can tear them apart and leave them on the
Mm,
bathroom floor, whatever. But I will say within that it bothers me when people say that because of what we're talking about, because I think, for example, sibling loss is one of the most horrendous things that can happen to somebody, like unexpected young sibling loss.
mm,
When we talk about the losses that shape us, which are really because they're the deaths of the people who have shaped us, right? And so if you have, and again, like I don't want to be arguing like which is worse. All I'm saying is I don't think we can say unilaterally that one kind of loss is quote unquote worse than another.
for sure. I
But back to the
completely agree.
bubble.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, because of that, because my sister and I were so close, because I had the amazing luck to have the person who was my sister also be my best friend, the person who I had never walked a day on this earth without. Right. And so she was 3 years older than me. And so for me, even though I had, look, I mean, it wasn't like the most charmed existence, but it was a pretty charmed existence, to be honest. And that's why I say I was kind of plodding along in my hazy little bubble and everything was hunky dory. And so this tearing of the fabric of my life, of understanding of there is no rhyme or reason, that we have zero control, all those things,
Mm.
that to experience it so viscerally. And now I'm mixing my metaphors with my hazy bubble and my tearing of the fabric, but bear with me. So that after that bubble was punctured, I did see things differently. I did understand that anything can happen. I did understand that we can imagine our futures to look one way, and that imagining may be nothing more than fantasy. And I understood that there are no guarantees. I understood it viscerally after my sister died. And I do think that had I not experienced such profound loss before my daughter Dahlia's diagnosis, perhaps some of those understandings that I was able to integrate decades earlier, well, I guess it wasn't decades from her diagnosis, but you know what I mean, all those years earlier, it may have been even more complex than it was.
I think that makes perfect sense that it's well the thing that you said about like that it because it has to do with the relationship between you and the person who died that makes it um feel the way that it feels. So someone who is estranged from their parent will probably not have the same experience of their death as I did with my dad, and we were very close,
Right.
or yeah, like with Annie having over a decade between her diagnosis and her death is a different experience than someone losing their 14-year-old to, suicide or something like that. It's
Right.
a different relationship to what you're anticipating is coming. And I like to think about it as like the destabilizing event, and so some people will have this type of shift in their perspective on reality and their place in the world through something different than death. But for me, it definitely was my daughter's diagnosis that was the shifting for me that changed how I was like, am I safe in the world anymore? Is anything
Yes.
okay? Can anything
Yes.
remain untouched from the possibility of pain?
Exactly. I think that's I love thinking about it that way, with what is that destabilizing event. And it's so interesting. One of my best friends in the world Her son died at 18, a year before Dahlia dying at 17. He was healthy and went to sleep one night and didn't wake up. And so, here, two best friends who have known each other since we were kids have the same quote unquote result, right? Losing an
Hmm.
18-year-old, losing a 17-year-old, but so different in every way practically, because we had been living for all those years leading up to it with the knowledge of the illness, with the day-to-day of the medical management, with all that, as compared to just boom, not waking up. And it is really, you just can't compare. There's just no, the nuances are so different. But the other thing that you and I have in common is that we watched our girls
Mm.
lose functionality. I don't know about you, but I don't know many people whose kids lived in to be teenagers who had the degenerative aspect. And
Mm.
so there's so much grief we had before the capital G grief.
Yeah. I like to think about it as like little losses or saying goodbye in increments.
Mm.
And the only other thing I can think to compare it to is someone who has experience with a loved one who develops dementia or Alzheimer's,
Right.
where you
I agree.
watch the person that you knew slowly disappear and
Mm,
their ability to care for themselves slowly disappear.
exactly.
And that's the only other context where I can think of that would be the same kind of
Right.
slow degeneration of skills and connection, really.
Yeah, I agree. And it's horrible in both situations. And when you're watching a child who is at the same time learning and growing and losing, right?
Yeah.
It's a whole different kind of thing rather than at the, in the final act of a long life.
Yeah. Yeah. So the question that kind of popped up for me is like, how, when this destabilizing event happens, how do we keep ourselves from becoming completely mired in like the four words I wrote down are cynicism, hypervigilance, fear, and worry. And
Mm.
I'm curious about if the dynamics are different for someone who hears our story but hasn't experienced a destabilizing event or loss like that themselves versus someone who has. Like, I don't what am I asking here? It's I don't feel the same level of worry for my other children that I think I would have if I hadn't gone through experiencing the death of a child and being on this side of it, if that makes sense.
Do you not feel the same worry because most things that happen in this world, the vast majority, are not going to be as bad as what you've already witnessed, been through, experienced?
Uh,
Or
mm,
is it the polar opposite, which is you've been there once and you understand how this these things can play out? Like, I could see it being either end of that spectrum.
and I think it might be both. Like, I've told this story before, but I remember going on a walk maybe the week after Annie died, and there's this particular house that there's a German Shepherd that sometimes shows up and usually stays on the lawn. But one time I was afraid that it was going to come at me. It, came out into the road and was barking at me, and I was really afraid. So the week after Annie died, I'm on this walk and I'm approaching this house and I'm feeling this fear rise up in me about this dog. And then it didn't have the same like sharpness to it at all because I was like, come at me, bro. Like, I've already gone through the hard thing. Like, like
Right.
getting attacked by a dog isn't going to be as bad as like what I just went through. And
Mhm.
so in some ways, like, I do feel a little bit like, what do you got, world? Like, I've been to those deep dark places and I'm on the other side of it. And like,
Yes.
I'm okay. Like, I made it through, not unscathed or untattered, but like, I'm still here and I still view the world as like a hopeful, beautiful place
All right. Well, we
somehow.
need to talk about that because so do
Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
very much so. And I'll tell you that after my sister died, a few years later, my mother and I were flying from Boston to Chicago. So I had unusual experience of watching for years how my parents integrated the death of their daughter
Hmm.
that then later became so relevant to me. But on this flight, it got very, very turbulent. And I'm not a great flyer under the best of circumstances, but I started freaking out. And I look at my mom and she's doing her crossword puzzle and, whatever. And I was like, mom, like I couldn't understand why she wasn't freaking out too. And I was like, aren't you scared? Whatever. And she just looked at me and, knowing her, she probably like laughed and, toasted her screwdriver, her the drink, not the tool,
You can't
in
bring
my
those on plane.
direction. Yeah, I can't, even then you couldn't bring a screwdriver on the plane. But what said, darling, how would I in the world would I be scared of something like, some bumps on a plane after what I had been through? Like she was unfreak outable, unscarable after the death of her daughter. So yeah, it's like bring on the German Shepherd or whatever. Like what do you got for me?
Mm.
But I love this idea. And I think this is why I resonated so much with your talk, with your TED talk, but this idea that like we still are hopeful people. Because I think sometimes people, particularly people who maybe have gone through really hard things and have not um, found joy again, will look at it and be like, how can like they don't get it.
Mm.
And I feel like it is so core to who I am to be hopeful, to be even more committed to hope, more committed to joy than I was before, more deliberately committed. And I love that I sense that in you as well.
Yeah, that's been a really big question for me. Like my little research brain has noodled with this for the last, several years in particular, where I've wondered how much is a choice, how much is personality, how much is support, how, like what are the factors in place that stimulate someone towards hopefulness? Because I do think that there are many people who go through hard things and they wonder if that's even possible for them. And they look at people like us and maybe think that we're, I don't know, like a little bit off our rockers or something like that, because like I'm so like excited about joy, you know? And so I've like wondered like what the pieces are in place. And I am in school right now. I'm a student, and one class that I have this term is positive psychology. And something clicked into place for me when I read a couple of articles by, I even have it printed out right here, but by Martin Seligman, who is like one of the key people in this positive psychology movement. Because when I heard positive psychology before, what that sounded like to me was, how do we slap a happy face on hardship? And I was like, ew, this sounds gross. This sounds like toxic
Right.
positivity. Like, I don't like that at all. What it actually is, and I feel like I seriously like feel like a puzzle piece has been clicked into place, feel lit up about this. What it is actually like the scientific approach to understanding human flourishing and well-being. So many things in psychology are untestable only through, when you have someone sitting in your office and you're saying like, let's try these things and we see if they work out for these people, but positive psychology is actually like, we're not looking just at treating mental illness. We're actually saying like, how do we get people who, whether or not they have a mental illness, into positive well-being? How do we do that? And so I feel very excited about understanding a little bit more of these dynamics of like what contributes to human flourishing, even though all of us will at some point have our bubbles popped.
Have you gotten to the answer yet? Or do we need to
Some of it, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. I might actually have to bring up my notes, because one of the things that was really helpful to me is the way that they talk about positive psychology is that there are kind of 4 different ways to think about how you're doing in general. Let me pull this up in my school notes really quick. Okay, so the classification system for positive psychology, number one is high well-being, low mental illness would be considered flourishing. High well-being, high mental illness, struggling. Low well-being, high mental illness, floundering. Low well-being, low mental illness, languishing. So what I found so helpful about that is I don't have any like clinical diagnoses for things like depression, anxiety, any of the other like heavy hitters with borderline personality disorder, bipolar, anything like that. So I'm low in mental illness, but I also have gone through periods in my life where I have just had a real sense of low well-being. And that is exactly what it feels like. It feels like languishing. It feels like this
Mm.
like sense of almost like despair or hopelessness, but also it's different than having depression. So what I just really appreciate this like kind of like parsing out that there are two different things at play here, and that there are two different approaches to total holistic health and well-being than just the mental illness piece or just the well-being piece.
Right. I think that's fascinating. And I wonder how, if we take the well being piece and say, okay, how do we impact that? And how much of that are we
Yes.
born with versus develop versus, external factors contribute to? And I've wondered a lot about what are we born with in terms of
Mm,
resilience in particular versus what do we develop by circumstance. And I am not in school and I am not reading Seligman and other things, but I am having fascinating conversations with people all the time. And I'm landing somewhere in the middle because I do think, you probably have heard about the happiness set point.
mm,
Uh, and, for people who might not know about it, to me, that's just so interesting that everybody kind of has their natural happiness set point. And you can have, if you have a high happiness set point, really shitty things can happen and you are going to emerge doing okay. And if you have a low happiness set point, you can like win the lottery and all these great things happen, but you're going to end up low, right? Now, I don't like that because it supposes that you kind of get what you get and
mm.
you are where you are on that set point. It's almost like weight. Like you're going to always end up at your weight set point no matter how much or how little you eat. But I do think that there is something that we are born with. I really do believe that. And then I think it's also all the other factors. And for me, again, like my parents were so resilient and they went through so much even before their daughter died. And I was never like studying them in like a,
Mm.
you know, in like a weird way, but they were my parents and I lived with them and watched and I think kind of absorbed the fact that they were absolutely devastated and in despair and continued to have full lives after they lost their daughter. So I saw a model of how that can be done. So when we think about some of this stuff and are we born with, do we develop? I think it's a mixture.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And the question that I come back to then is like, uh, that it reminds me that it's super unhelpful to compare ourselves to anybody else. Like to compare how I'm feeling or how I'm doing with someone else who has experienced the same thing that I have. So social media obviously is like probably one of the worst things for this type of skill development, to not compare yourself to somebody else's circumstances. Because like, for example, you could be someone who is actually feeling pretty okay about where you're at financially, and you go on social media and you see someone else who has x amount of dollars, and they're looking like their life is so great, and you suddenly start questioning not just how much money you should have, but like your own sense of your own happiness. And
Mhm.
so if we instead can become students of ourselves, to say how I feel about XYZ thing in my life, I actually feel really good about, or I actually really want this to change. And there's not really any way to block out all the noise of other people who will contribute either on purpose or just, by accident to the way that we view our own lives. But that has to be one of the most important things that we can do, is become students of ourselves, where we really drill down to what brings me a deep sense of joy and meaning and purpose, what helps me feel most connected to other people, and start to lean into those things. I think that's the answer.
I love that. And I think that's also hard, right? I mean, it's so hard. I wish like I could just know this is what
Mhm.
brings me joy and this is what I'm going to do. And, there are little snippets of it, but I have yet to be able to say the thing. I've always wanted to be somebody who had like
Mm.
the thing, a very clear prescription of, do this, that, and the other thing, Jesse, and you will be, full of joy. I don't know. What have you as a student of yourself discovered?
I talked about this recently, probably on a reel or something, but about this idea that we have of finding our purpose, our capital P purpose. Because from in my experience, there are very few people that know what they quote unquote want to do with their lives. Like there's kids who are like, I know for sure when I grow up I'm going to be a doctor, or I'm going to be, this type of artist or whatever. I think that it really does us a disservice when we think about a singular purpose for our lives. I think more about it now in terms of purposes,
Hmm.
because the more that I grow and change and the more things that I experience, the more expansive my sense of how I'm going to contribute in the world and the people that I'm going to meet and the ways that I'm going to change. And there's just this heavy weight of find it that falls away when I instead remind myself that it's not a singular thing for me to find, and that I can trust the joy that comes with whatever the thing is that I find that I enjoy doing. I think that's a really difficult thing for people, because we're taught that the things that come easy to us, or the things that bring us a lot of joy, like that's not good. In a very like forward moving productivity optimization kind of culture that we live in, we are very distrustful of the things that feel really good, because we're conditioned to think if I'm not working hard at it, then it's not as valuable. And so
Right.
the more that we can kind of dispel the myth of the capital P purpose, and also just pay attention to how things feel when we're doing them, and trust that like that there's so much joy on the other side of that. And there's also this false belief that like if I just find the capital P purpose, I will be happy all the time, like that we would be somehow like that would inoculate us against like sadness or
Right.
hard things happening.
Well, I also think that when we think about the capital P purpose, we tend to think that that's something that we're going to be paid for. And when
Mm,
we think about
mm-hmm.
purposes, that doesn't necessarily have to be what you are doing for your income. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think it all does start when, we say, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to be? And I remember asking one of my kids that, and they were young, and my little guy, and he said, a human being. And I was like, well,
Oh
that's
my
like the best
gosh.
answer I've ever
I
heard.
love that.
I mean, I think he might not
Mm,
have understood the question, but that's not the point. It was a gorgeous answer. And so I do like that. And I do like the idea that, we don't have to find this one thing, because I will tell you, I do feel like my whole life I've been wondering what my quote unquote
mm,
capital B or what my thing is, and it's so ridiculous. I
yeah.
mean, I've done a million things. But I still am like, but yeah, but what's that one thing? I don't know why there's something to me that feels so alluring about
Mm.
the possibility of having a thing.
I wonder how much of it has to do with just, from like a biological neuroscience perspective, how much our brains love predictability. And
Oh,
so
I love
this,
predictability.
this idea of like, if I can figure out what my purpose is, and I can give my brain a break from having to look for what the purpose is, and then I would just know what to do. The things would fall into place, and I wouldn't have to worry so much about all this stuff. Perhaps that might be one of the components to the
But if
pressure that we put on
anybody should
ourselves.
understand that the idea of predictability is a fantasy, it should be the two of us, right? I mean, talk
Mm,
about not having predictability. So, I guess again, it could be you emerge from that either feeling like, hey, I don't need predictability. Look what I've done. Or it could be, oh my God, after everything I've been through, I just want to
mm,
have something predictable. I know one of the things
yes.
that I longed for so many years wasn't predictability, it was boredom. I thought that would be the most luxurious thing I could imagine, being
Mm.
bored. Because, as an intense medical caregiver for your child, which is living on the precipice 24/7, which is, you know, 17 full-time jobs all wrapped in one. And, PS, we had other kids and I was working full time, etc. That this idea of like having a whole afternoon, for example, stretching in front of me with nothing I had to do seemed like that would be the most luxurious thing I could imagine.
I wonder what's the feeling that you would be attempting to capture in boredom.
Yes. And by the way, now if I don't have a million things planned, it's uncomfortable for me. So that's now
Mm.
on the flip side of that. Now that I am no longer a medical parent and I am no longer working full time. So it's interesting. But
Mm.
I think then it was just this feeling of constant uh, busyness, constant awareness, again, hypervigilance, constant. There
Yeah.
were at any moment there were 18 different things that I needed to do. So maybe it was that maybe the feeling would be, things are okay. Because
Mm.
if things are okay, then I don't feel like there's a million things I have to be doing. Maybe that was the feeling and that wasn't going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a really good thing for people to think through about something that they want more of in their life, to drill down into what's the feeling that I'm seeking in that. Because I think what happens a lot of time is like we have this idea of the thing that we want to accomplish, and then we accomplish it and we're like, oh, like that wasn't either as long lasting of a good feeling, or it
Yes.
didn't end up feeling the way that I thought I was going to. And so to like ask the question of like, what's the perhaps the thing that I'm pinning this hope of the experience
Yeah.
on, how could I actually factor that into my day now? And that might
Okay.
be
So
one of the keys to a joy-filled, resilient life.
I think we just cracked it. But
Okay,
no,
we're done.
solved it. No, but I love that. The other night, uh, I asked, I had a stomach ache. I asked my husband, I was like, you got to go get me ginger ale. So he comes home with ginger ale and 2 lottery tickets. Okay. We don't usually buy lottery tickets. That's not part of our thing. But there he was at the checkout and it was at like 255 million or whatever. I don't even know. So he buys the lottery tickets. Spoiler alert, we did not win. But
Oh man.
we had the most fun over dinner that night, really, really drilling down into what we would do when we, found out we won the next day. Cause I got to tell you, I was pretty sure we would win. I felt like it was going to be our
I bet.
karmic like payback that we were going to win. So we were going through what we were going to do. And then my wise husband said, all right, but like, what of these things could we do in some way if we don't win the lottery? And that was really like a great exercise to realize like, okay, maybe we're not buying a house in Kauai, but could we rent a house for 2 weeks? You know what I mean? It started giving us this idea. And that's reminding me of what you're saying, which is what is the feeling we're going for with these things? And how can we think about not as non-lottery winners, how could we make some of those things, get some of that same feeling? And you know what? Most of the things on the list, there was some way to mudge it such that we could do it even if we were not, 100 millionaire, 100,
Mm.
$200 million winners.
That's a great exercise. And that's, I
Yeah.
mean, really what I thought was perhaps that's one of our purposes, is to find ways to inject those experiences into our lives.
Yes. Yeah.
Like, what if, mm, talking about this from more like a meta perspective, like the purpose of being human. And I have perhaps a tumultuous relationship with religion, partly because of everything that I've gone through with Annie. That was one of the worldviews that got completely blown open. Was my perspective on why things happen and who's in charge got completely obliterated. And on this side of investigation, and I wouldn't even say like piecing things back together, it's not even that. It's more just like an openness to many different ways of experiencing the unknown and the mystery of it all. Sometimes I think is one of the purposes of being human to feel. Animals sense things and they move by instinct, and humans make sense. So we move, yes, by intuition, but also by the stories that we tell ourselves and we tell each other to make sense of our experiences. And so what if part of the purpose of being human is to feel all the things, the highs and the lows, to and if we are living an existence that we don't know how or don't feel like we have permission to have moments of deep joy and satisfaction in our lives, that we're missing out on part of what it means to be human. I love the question
I
that you
love
asked
that
your
so
son.
much. And I think a lot of people going through what we went through would not give themselves permission to have deep joy,
Oh yeah,
right?
we should definitely talk about this.
We should
Yes,
definitely talk
because
about this. But I also want to say, then we also need to be able to give ourselves permission to feel the uncomfortable stuff too, the sadness, the fear, the anxiety, all that kind of stuff, and not have the goal always be cheer up, Charlie, right?
yes,
It's not
yeah,
always to get us out of that. Sometimes it's to respect it. And I think that so many of us are more inclined to try to, for ourselves and for the people we love, pull them out of those feelings that don't seem, objectively positive.
yeah, yeah. I agree with that 100%. The urge to, as quickly as possible, get out of the discomfort. That's been one of the big lessons, because in my experience, and many people have experienced this as well, is the more that we neglect or ignore or stuff down the uncomfortable emotions, I'm not even going to call them negative emotions, but the real
Right.
uncomfortable ones, it will spill out at the most inopportune times.
At the
And the
most
ways that yes, like, I thought I was dealing with this. Well, you weren't. And
right.
so like a big part of what has felt like how to still be in my life is learning how to be with myself in a very kind and compassionate and patient way when I'm really down in those deep dark feelings.
Yes. But let's get back to this other side of it, which is how so many people would think or would feel that it wasn't appropriate.
Mm.
And I have appropriate like in quotes and itals and all the things, because to experience joy when we were going through the worst, most horrific reality. And I think it was even more important. It wasn't just that it was allowed, but it was so much more important to be able to have that true joy.
Yeah, I was sharing with a friend that sometimes I feel guilty about how well I'm doing.
Mhm.
Like that I
Yeah.
will sometimes hide my joy, partly because I don't want to be insensitive to other people who have gone through what I've gone through and are not doing okay. Um, but that is a really weird thing, to feel ashamed of the joy, kind of.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think that we are really skilled at making ourselves feel guilty for a whole host of things. So we're not sad enough, we feel guilty. We are too sad, we feel guilty. We're not
Mm,
grieving right. That's again in quotes. We feel guilty. We're not making meaning out of our grief. We feel guilty. I mean, there's so many, we are really, really good at twisting ourselves in knots over this stuff.
Is that something that you've struggled with as far as like the joy piece, not wanting to show
What
people how
I've
okay you are?
struggled with is feeling like I do not want, you mentioned before, toxic positivity. I think of it as Pollyanna. And for
Mm,
me, I feel like being able to find, create, feel joy alongside all the, sorrow is my way of integrating who my daughter was. And so I feel a little bit proud because I feel like I watched her do this. And I'm proud that I get to have learned this from her. And again, that too could sound Pollyanna and maybe it's revisionist history. But
mm,
the way I look at it is, as horrible as what we were privy to was, it was that much more so. I will only speak for in my situation. It was that much more so for Dahlia. I was witness to it. I was, prime caregiver, all that kind of stuff. She was going through it. She was losing slowly, incrementally over the period of a dozen years, everything. And she smiled and laughed as long as she could move her facial muscles.
mm,
She wanted to do things. She wanted to go out. She wanted to play. She wanted to be a kid. And so she was making that joy. So so then if I, in the midst of such sadness and despair, can try to do that same thing, then I feel like, geez, that's honoring her. So I feel proud of it.
mm. It's a really beautiful way to, like you said, to integrate her into
Yeah.
your life on this side of that experience. Mm,
Yeah. Yeah. Can we talk about hope?
yeah, yeah.
Because I think that, I mean, joy is one thing. And I think hope is another that, to me, and you alluded to this before a little bit too, which is, I think hope is the opposite of despair.
Mm,
And I feel like we stayed hopeful throughout Dahlia's life. What we hoped for changed, but we kept the feeling of hope. And sometimes what we were hoping for was something very, very, very small that somebody else wouldn't even notice. I mean, I'm not saying that we might have been wishing for a miracle, wishing for a cure, but I think that's different from hope. And I'm wondering about you and your relationship with hope then and now.
well, the way that I talked about hope in my TED talk anyway was that the way that we think about hope usually is that we tie it to an expectation that things will improve. And what I was suggesting for people was that we, instead of focusing on external realities changing, that we instead redirect the hope to an inner possibility, that there's always room for growth, that there's always room for an expansion of our capability to feel all the things we feel. There's always a possibility of connection with other people. And I think that, I mean, maybe that's just a way of coping with a diagnosis like that, where, when she was diagnosed, they were like, the research on this for a cure is in the dark ages. Like, they told us right out of the gate, you will not see the light of any of these, curing things on this side of things. And so in that context, I have a different relationship to hope too than a family with a sick child where there are treatment options available. That's a different dynamic too.
Right.
Um, and I think the very early on, I didn't then cling to any hope for a cure or a miracle for her. And the benefit to doing that, whether or not I chose that or that's just what happened, like that's the mystery of the human brain and the psyche. But it made me look very realistically at the cards that I was dealt and to say, okay, I'm going to work with what I've got instead of fixating on what I hope to happen outside of this reality that's just right in front of me. And so I really started to pay attention to what things I actually had control over. And so for me, I shifted this hope from how could I fix this to what have we got to work with? And I then started to just view Annie's life through the perspective of how do I increase the possibility of joy for her, that regardless of her skill level, what she's able to do, could I still find something every day that made her be happy that she was here, that she's happy to be in her life, that and then on top of that, ways that I could help her be connected to other people. And so that influenced how I went into an IEP meeting. That influenced how I was talking to the palliative care team. That influenced how we talked about end of life interventions. It influenced all of our decisions. And that, when even like with COVID, that was a really difficult few years to go through because of the worry of her, because the reality was that in the first few weeks after her diagnosis when she was 3, and I was asking the doctor, the geneticist, like, what do these kids usually die from? And they said respiratory illness, respiratory failure. And then COVID comes and it's a respiratory illness. Like, it's terrifying. And so it was like, how even in the midst of COVID, how do I still hang on to these goals that I have for her life of joy and connection? Yeah, that was a very long-winded answer to that question.
No, I love it and I relate to it. And also I love the way you put it. It's so beautiful. And I feel very aligned with what you're saying all the way through to COVID, when all of a sudden, ventilators and respiratory illnesses and everything was like, headlines in the news. And I was like, welcome to our world. That's what we had been living, excuse me. But I think that is such an interesting way to put it in terms of pinning hope on things that are external, which really then do become wishes, things that you have nothing to do with versus those things that are within.
What is your relationship like to hope?
I feel like I was saying earlier, with hope being the opposite of despair, and I always want to have things that I am hoping for and things that I can achieve, hopes that can be accomplished, because that is what gives us the strength to keep hoping. So if I'm going to hope for something that is totally outside of my sphere of influence, and that may or may not happen, I'm going to hope that I win the lottery. Okay, I'm not going to win this. So that's a wish. That's a fantasy. That's fun, right? But if I can hope that, gee, Morgan and I are going to have a conversation. I hope we have a great conversation. And then we make it so, right? And then I'm hoping that whatever the things are, and as it was pertained to caregiving, it's just as you say, it was hoping that we could, for a long time, our hope was, how can we continue to give Dahlia and our other kids as meaningful a childhood as possible in the face of all of these horrific things, right? And so the more that we could do that, the more emboldened we felt to continue hoping.
I think one of the secret hopes that accompanied a big fear for me before Annie died was, I hope I'm going to be okay. I was really worried about that. I was really worried that I was going to completely fall apart, that I was going to not recognize myself, that I was going to become a shell of the person that I was. I was really afraid of that. And the hope that like I'm going to be okay is tricky because there's no way to really see if that's possible or not. But what it did do was exactly what you're talking about. It like made me take action. It made me start to look at what are the ways that I can increase my chances that I'll be okay on the other side of this.
Yeah.
And two really important components to that I think will be very helpful to people who are listening to this. One is that because I had the benefit / curse of knowing that she would likely die in her mid-teens, I found something that would continue after she died. So I started to become involved in activities that could still continue after she died. Like I didn't have my entire world be her and her care, because what would happen when that wasn't necessary anymore? And I definitely went through this like very like the way that I describe it is like I for the bulk of well, I mean, a big chunk of my adult life, my life orbited around Annie, Planet Annie. And then when that planet wasn't there anymore, I was like, boo, like off into space, like untethered, like, what am I doing with my day and my life, you know?
Yes,
And so like
everything. Yes,
yes,
I always say it's like, logistically, spiritually, psychologically, physically, emotionally, everything revolved
yes,
around Annie and Dahlia. Yes, and then boom,
yes.
done.
In an instant, it's gone. Yeah. And so what was really helpful and practical was finding something that would connect me to myself, I guess, on the other side of that huge
Yes,
life changing event.
I
And the
always
other
say that
piece,
that's. Oh, sorry.
no, go ahead.
Uh, on that note, I was going to say that I always say that for me, I kept working in my
Mm,
job that I had
hmm.
before Dahlia was even born. I kept working in that job all the way through. And what I say to that point is it was allowing me to remember not only who I was before, but also to remember who I would be after. And
Yes.
that my identity wasn't fully as Dahlia's mother, caregiver, whatever.
Yeah.
And what's the second thing that you were going to say that really helped?
Well, first I'll say that I think a lot of people go through this when they become empty nesters.
Mm,
Parents who have really committed to being the best, most hands-on, most very present parent that they can be. And then when the kids don't need them anymore, they're like, what is happening?
yeah.
So this is practical advice for everyone. Find something that's just for you, that you enjoy. And the second piece of that is like really defining for myself what self-care is, because I know that like self-care can sound kind of icky and like selfish, or like, yeah, it's a bubble bath or it's a shopping trip or whatever. No. Like I'm talking about like deep, meaningful self-care, where you're really developing habits and things that make you feel connected to yourself, that make you feel
Mm,
connected to your body, that make you feel connected to your spirit, that make you feel connected to meaning. So finding those things and carving out time to make those a priority are two just really practical ways to get through something where you increase your odds of being okay on the other side of them.
I love that. That's such good, useful advice. Can you share with us what one of those things was for you when you think about your self care?
Meditation, for sure. For sure. um I have a very busy mind and a very chatty internal dialogue. The thoughts are always there and they're always coming. And meditation became the practice of uh, not just observing my thoughts, but observing the body's sensations and catching myself in the gap between the stimulus and response. So it
Mm,
has helped me be a more patient person with my kids. It has helped me pay attention to when I'm like just on the brink of being overstimulated and behaving in a way that maybe isn't great. It's just a way to like increase that gap between whatever's happening and my response to it, or the story that I tell myself about it. So meditation for me, hands down, has been the best. It's been the best self-care practice for sure.
I love that. I'm trying to get there, but as I've said on this show before, I have yet to master or even even to practice, right? I guess we don't
Mm.
say we master meditation. I have yet to practice effectively, but that is a goal for me.
Do you have one that aligns and is easy for you to participate in for yourself?
I think when I think, and this is interesting because I guess it goes maybe back to this idea of like, to be bored. And I use that word,
Mm.
kind of a tongue in cheek because I'm not really ever bored. But for me, curling up with a good book is a great way to, maybe that's how I quiet my mind or get my mind
Yeah.
out of its own patterns and into some other kind of just totally absorbing story. I'm a voracious reader, and I think that that is something that is a great both escape and way of taking care.
Yeah, I think that's a great one. That's a
Yeah.
great one. It's again, it's like you have to find the thing that resonates with you, Like
Yeah.
if it's like meditation is awful and it feels terrible, okay, maybe it's taking a walk and developing the habit of noticing
Yeah.
what's around you, or really paying attention, to get the AirPods out of your ears and just listen for the way that the trees sound as they're moving in the
Yeah.
wind. Those types of things that because I think that might be the key to self-care, is what helps us be very present with
Yeah.
where we are.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the things that just is so interesting to me is how we meet people along the way who, you were going through something that was in many ways so similar to what I was going through. We didn't know each other existed. And yet, once we meet, it's like there's just so
Hmm.
much commonality. And also, just in this conversation and the others we've had, so many beautiful learnings. So I'm very glad we shared a stage that evening.
Me too. Will you tell, I know the people who listen to your podcast already know this, but the people who listen to mine, will you tell us about your book?
Yes. Thank you for asking. So, my book
Mhm.
is called Breathtaking, a memoir of family, dreams, and broken genes. And it is the story of how my husband and I built our family in the first place, which was long and circuitous, and talk about an unexpected journey. That was definitely how we made our family, adopting 3 children from Guatemala. And then it's really the story of raising Dahlia. It is not a book about Dahlia's death. It's very much a book about Dahlia's life, and a book about how as it's my memoir, went from thinking that I had control, thinking that I knew what life was going to look like, thinking that one could only experience one kind of thing at a time, how I learned that all those things aren't true and that joy and sorrow can hold hands
Hmm.
and dance together, and how I learned that there are ways to create beauty and meaning and joy, even in the midst of really horrendous situations, and also to share my gorgeous daughter with the world. So wherever people get their books, you can get Breathtaking, and I hope
Hmm.
people will, and also check out my podcast. So again, if you're listening to I Don't Know How You Do It, then you don't need to hear this. But for those of you who might be new to it, it is where I have conversations with people who, for whatever reason, whether they chose unconventional paths or whether the impossible chose them, these are people who are often faced with other people saying to them, "I don't know how you do it."
Hmm.
Tell
How
tell us about your podcast.
Okay, and then I want to ask you about that question because it's a really good one, or the statement. My podcast, P.S. We Expire, is about conversations that help us navigate being human. And also, I try and take an approach to it that none of the topics are off limits. Like I know we started this podcast out by saying something that might be potentially very offensive or insensitive by saying we have dead kids. Like it's this like these are all things that people want to talk about, and we either don't have the environment where that's expected or encouraged, or we ourselves are afraid to take a peek at these areas of our lives that are it feels scary to go into alone. I One of the classes that I really wanted to take this term was a seminar on death undying. It filled up in 15 minutes, which
Wow.
the professor told me she's been teaching that class for 13 years, and every semester she thinks, are people going to want to take this? And it fills up so fast, which tells me that people want to be having these types of conversations, and we're not for some reason or another. So the goal of my podcast, I'm not just talking about death, so don't worry about that. But really, like, can we just stop with like all of the feelings of like, oh, I shouldn't be talking about this, or there's a certain way to talk about it or whatever, and like, let's just talk about it. Let's just get into it. So that's the podcast.
Awesome.
What I wanted to ask you about is, how do you respond when people say that to you? I don't know how you do it.
Well, and that's why, I mean, I wrote an article about this years ago. I mean, I think it might have even been when Talia was newly diagnosed, or maybe even before her diagnosis, when it was just like, busy working mom of 3 and blah, 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 and whatever. And every day people would say, I don't know how you do it. And so it really is, the name of the podcast is tongue in cheek, because there is no great way to respond to that. And nor is anybody really looking for a meaningful response. Nobody wants me to say like, well, pull up a chair and let me tell you exactly how I do it. Right?
Let me pull out my calendar and show you all the appointments we have.
And any way you answer it, oh, what choice do I have? Or, oh, you do it too, or it's not so bad, or it's worse than you think, or whatever. Like there's no way to respond to a statement like that. And we know people are trying to acknowledge that what we are going through is big, and they say it out of respect, but it is one of those many, many, many things people say that doesn't really have a ample response, which is why I then said, okay, let's get into some conversations and find out how people do the things that look so undoable.
What are some of the recurring kind of themes, or I wouldn't even say like practical pieces of advice, but like, what are some of the recurring things that you see from the conversations that
It's
you
things
have on
we've
your
talked about. I'll
podcast?
give you 3 off the top of my head. I'll give you 4 off the top of my head. Number 1 is community. That's number 1, 2, and 3,
Yes.
probably. Everybody talks about that, whether that's, people I've known my whole life, or the people I've met who are going through what I'm going through, or the people who are 3 steps ahead of me and I've been able to learn from them, or whatever it is. Community. That's number 1. Number 2, the rest aren't in any particular order. Having something that is very much their identity, so that whatever the thing is that others look at and say, I don't know how you do it, they have this other thing that is core to who they are. It's what we were talking about just a moment ago, about maintaining some piece of your identity that is you. Number 3 is spirituality, and that can look a lot of different ways. That might look like organized religion, that might look like meditation or yoga practice, right? So that is definitely has a lot of variety to it. And then number 4, I think, is having is a combination of what we were talking about with self-care, and also having some logistics in place, some more practical tools that help with whatever the thing is that we're talking about. So that can take a variety of forms depending on what that particular conversation is. But it has been one of my goals to elevate what are those themes that cross over all of these different individual stories.
I love that so much. Because it really does like highlight the fact that all of us really are going through this life with the same limitations, I suppose, on like future planning, or these bodies that we have to wear that have limitations to them, that get tired, that you need to take naps or eat good food or whatever, that I think that one of the biggest takeaways from my experience with Annie is that she broke down so many barriers to connections with all different types of people. Like, she literally didn't see or care about so many of those things. Like, I love talking about when she was still when we would still take her out quite a bit, and she was still walking and running around and eating food by mouth. We would be at a restaurant, and the waiter would be walking by, and she would just reach up and like grab something off of the plate. Like, she had like no sense of like
God,
social norms or anything. She was just oblivious to that, and was such a joyful, present little kid. And it really helped me look at so many of these things that we're like, this is how it is. And it made me ask, like, well, is it like, or did we just all decide that that's how it was supposed to be, but it's not actually like that, and not that I would do things like that. But it really helps me connect with people in a way where I'm like, all of these labels that we've placed on things, like we all made those up. And
We
so
all make
there's
those up.
we made those up. And so there's always an opportunity to be like, hey, I'm still just looking at the eyes of another human who's still going through these things, who still needs community, who still needs something for them that's important and meaningful to them, that still needs spirituality, that still needs practical tools. I'm still in this space with you, other human.
I love that.
And
And I
Annie was
love
like
that image of Annie
greatest model of
That's
being like,
great.
or sticking her hands in someone's coffee, like, stuff like that. Oh.
Well, I hope that everybody listening who's on my side of the fence, so to speak, will check out your podcast. Yes, we
Same for
aspire.
my listeners. Yes, same
Check
for
out
my
your TED
listeners. Go over
Talk.
and check out
So I'm
it.
sure in each other, we'll have the notes of how to reach each other in our show.
Yes, definitely. Are there any other like final thoughts that you want to impart to our listeners, or pieces of advice, or something that we should know about you?
I love having conversations. I love connecting. So I invite anybody to reach out, please. And, whether that's through social or my website, which is jessicafeinstories.com. And it's FEIN. But I really do get such joy out of these kinds of conversations and talking to people. So hopefully, people reach out, and that would be great. What about you? Other thoughts you have?
Same. I one of the things I like the most is just being able to connect with real people. So the more that we can do that, I put all the links to everything in the show notes, of course. But yeah, continuing this conversation with you, and have a good rest of your day too.